Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 must-start players for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, the must-start players that I am looking for are guys that are currently being started in less than 30% of leagues. Majority of these players are going to potentially be on roster or maybe on waivers for you going into Week 1, and they should be reconsidered as potential starting options based on the opportunities that they have and the matchups that they're facing up against this upcoming weekend. After we talk about a couple running backs, wide receivers, tight ends going into Week 1, then we'll transition to talking about some underdog pick'ems for this upcoming weekend to help you guys out. Before we begin, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship, and that begins with winning our Week 1 matchups. Now, also, don't forget to check out Underdog Fantasy. We will be transitioning to that conversation a little bit later in today's episode, but if you want to go ahead and sign up today, you can go ahead, travel to the description of the video, click on the link, and when you use promo code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. We'll, of course, put together some pick'em slips. You can follow me, you can fade me. We'll be picking higher or lower on player statistics going into Week 1, whether it is total receiving yards, rushing attempts, fantasy points, touchdowns, all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that as we progress throughout today's video. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this conversation, beginning with the first player I wanted to mention as a Week 1 must-start player, Elijah Moore, wide receiver of the New York Jets. Now, earlier this week, I did mention Elijah Moore in my wide receiver rankings video. I mentioned that he had a lot of potential, and though he was lower ranked, I'm beginning to kind of sneak him up my rankings as we progress throughout the week. Now, another reminder for those of you who didn't check that out. Last season, Elijah Moore was the number 1 wide receiver option for the Jets when he was healthy and active between week 7 through 13. After their bye week, he purely took over and was averaging 8.14 targets per game and over 15 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. Of course, a lot of touchdowns helping him elevate his overall production. Now, in the singular game last season that he played with Joe Flacco under center, he had himself 11 targets that led to 8 receptions, 141 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown for 25.6 total fantasy points. Overall, if you're able to get into a conversation where you're putting up incredible numbers with a quarterback who has experience, is in a revenge game against his former team, and you're the number 1 receiving option against a team that is really good in terms of stopping the run, again, Calais Campbell, Patrick Queen, they've certainly got enough talent to stop the run on the other side of the ball, which is only going to force the Jets, like they did all of last season, to throw the ball. Again, like I've mentioned this offseason on multiple occasions, the Jets threw the ball over 60% of the time last season. So if they're going to be in a similar scenario, of course, Elijah Moore, their number 1 receiving option, is going to be the guy that's getting the ball in his direction. The fact that he is only being, started in less than 30% of leagues, 29% right now, is surprising to me, and that's why I wanted to mention him as someone that you should be reconsidering potentially as that flex option this upcoming weekend. Moving on, let's talk about Miles Sanders. I had Miles Sanders relatively high ranked, primarily because he is a good running back. And though last season he wasn't able to demonstrate that in a fantasy sense, the guy was still averaging 5.5 yards per carry last year. Going into this upcoming week, we're going to see a lot of shades of what we saw last year. And what exactly did we see? We saw the Detroit Lions not able to stop many running backs over the course of the 18-week season, and specifically against the Philadelphia Eagles, they also struggled mightily. Last season, when Jordan Howard, Boston Scott were the primary tandem within this backfield while Miles Sanders were injured, against the Detroit Lions, those guys tore up that defense. One of them scored 18 fantasy points, the other 17.7. As a whole total running back core against that defense last year, the Philadelphia Eagles backfield totaled 37 total rushing attempts for 144 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns. That's 38.4 total fantasy points from those contributing backs. Now, I'm expecting more of the same. And especially considering we have Miles Sanders now in the backfield, let's not forget, guys, Miles Sanders has been a great running back in the past. The guy's averaged 5.5 yards per carry last year when he came back from his injury from weeks 11 through 15. The guy was averaging 19.73 rushing attempts per game, 121 rushing yards per game, and 13.7 half PPR fantasy points per game, while only playing 47% of the offensive snaps for the Philadelphia Eagles and scoring 0 touchdowns throughout that span of time. If you're able to get this man the ball, he is going to find success quite easily. And before we move on, just to kind of give you a little bit more of an understanding as to just how bad the Detroit Lions were last year, and they'll continue to be in terms of stopping the run, they gave up 15 or more fantasy points in half PPR to 13 different running backs last season. Again, the amount of totals, I'm just going to go ahead and just from top to bottom, just give you some perspective as to those fantasy point totals from running backs against Detroit last year. 16.4, 38.5, 22.6, 22.8, 23.8, 17.7, 18, 15.3, 21.4. We're not done, by the way. 19.9, 23.1, 20.8, 31.5, and 12.6. Those are individual running back performances. Those aren't backfields combined. No, those are individual running backs who put up those numbers against Detroit last season. We've seen a lot of success. We're going to continue to see the same this upcoming week. Moving on to another running back I wanted to mention, another player that is currently being started in less than 30% of leagues. Currently, Kareem Hunt is identical to Miles Sanders, both being started in 20% of leagues only. 1 out of every 5 leagues, we're only seeing these guys, take the starting position. And really, I'm not surprised considering the fact that, of course, Miles Sanders did screw over many last season. But Kareem Hunt, again, besides getting injured, this guy's always been good. Again, throughout his entire career, unless he has missed big chunks of time, he's always been a top 10 running back at the end of season. So we already know he has the talent. We already know that he's going to be given the opportunity, considering this is a run-heavy approach from the Cleveland Browns with Jacoby Brissett under center. The only concern is people not knowing whether or not they're going to utilize him because maybe they want to trade him. I think they're all on the same page. Kareem Hunt is going to stay on roster until an offer is made that is going to come from another team that, is in need of a running back. Cough, cough, potentially the Rams. We'll see about that. But at this current moment in time, Kareem Hunt still is a valuable prospect. Again, last year, weeks 1 through 5, the guy was averaging 16.98 half PPR fantasy points per game. He was the number 5 overall running back from the first 5 weeks of the 2021 season. So why not again? When he has played with Nick Chubb in the lineup, he has averaged 13.24 fantasy points per game. They take on the Carolina Panthers. Now, I could go ahead and string a giant list of the amount of running back performances we've seen succeed against the Carolina Panthers over the last couple years, and there have been quite certainly a lot of them. But quite honestly, it's very similar to the prior conversation we had with Miles Sanders. This is an abusive offensive line that is going to take advantage of the Carolina Panthers' lack of a run-stopping ability. And in my opinion, as they continue to run the ball, and they're not really committed to only giving Nick Chubb goal line attempts, if Kareem Hunt is out there in that drive and he has the hot hand, they're going to get him the ball. They're going to get him utilization in the passing game. He's going to be a pretty good option. Moving on to Brandon Aiyuk, another one of these players that I mentioned in my wide receiver rankings video in terms of a player that could end up having a great week. And as the week has progressed, we have seen George Kittle go from having a groin injury on Monday to not practicing and participating on Wednesday and Thursday. Now, I'm recording this in the morning on Friday, and I'm not sure as to what his status is as of later this afternoon if he ends up practicing, but my assumption is that if he sustained that injury on Monday, missing Wednesday and Thursday practice is not a great indicator as to his potential of playing this upcoming week. And if that's going to be the case, we can very easily say that the 49ers rushing attack is going to be far less impactful without George Kittle in the lineup. He is a huge difference maker in terms of a run blocking threat. And if he's not going to be there in terms of a receiving threat either, of course, Trey Lance is going to have to look elsewhere. And where is he going to look in the direction of? Deebo Samuel, who we already expect to have a great week, but Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk is only being started in 24% of leagues at this current moment in time. And let's not forget, last season, weeks 9 through 18, he was averaging 11.26 fantasy points per game while playing a significantly higher percentage of snaps than in comparison to the first half of the 2021 season. If we're back on track to getting Brandon Aiyuk the ball on a consistent rate, I expect to see him find success. Last season, when Trey Lance was the starting quarterback against the Houston Texans, of course, Brandon Aiyuk was active in that game, got 6 targets, 4 catches, 94 receiving yards, 11.4 half PPR fantasy points. If you're playing against the Chicago Bears secondary, which I believe is an extremely advantageous matchup, of course, we should be reconsidering Brandon Aiyuk as a potential starting option here as a wide receiver 3 with incredible upside based on the fact that if that running game isn't as potent and you're going to have to pass even more, he's built enough of a rapport this offseason with Trey Lance to be that number 1 target, if asked to be so. Moving on, let's talk about Gerald Everett, somebody that I mentioned yesterday on my tight ends video, and I know many of you, potentially didn't look at the video, but if you are in the scenario in which you had George Kittle, speaking of Brandon Aiyuk, but you had George Kittle and he's not going to be playing, or you have, Zach Ertz and he's not going to be playing, Gerald Everett has an incredible opportunity this week to be a perfect play. He's only being started in 3% of leagues, which means his availability on waivers is relatively high, especially if you're not playing in a deep league. Now, this is something that I mentioned throughout yesterday's video, but Darnell Parham is also questionable to play. He did not practice Wednesday or Thursday either. If we're going to be in a scenario where Darnell Parham, the second string tight end for this team, and the red zone threat of this team is not going to be there, well, then here comes Gerald Everett with a potential to be a top 10 fantasy tight end by the end of week 1. Again, let's not forget, last season when they took on the Las Vegas Raiders, the Los Angeles Chargers had the services of Jared Cook. In the 2 games that he played against the Las Vegas Raiders, he had himself a total of 26 fantasy points. In one game, 16 fantasy points. In the other, 10. Was able to get himself 7 targets in each game, over 4 receptions in each game, and over 70 receiving yards. Ended up getting himself a touchdown in one of those contests. We know that the Las Vegas Raiders defense isn't great in terms of stopping opposing tight ends, especially in terms of stopping opposing Chargers tight ends. I think there's going to be a lot of success found here from Gerald Everett, especially if, in fact, Donald Parham is out and you're in need of a tight end for this upcoming week. Moving on to Julio Jones. Now, this is a player that you don't have to start. I think this is another one of these contingency plan players similar to a Gerald Everett. Though as of right now, Julio Jones is only being started in 6% of leagues, I really do believe that if we get into a scenario where Chris Godwin is truly a game time decision, he fully practiced Wednesday, then did not participate on Thursday. I don't know if that's a bad sign, but it doesn't seem like a good sign to me. If you're going on ahead and practicing fully on Wednesday, maybe that was the offensive portion of practice and they didn't need to involve him in the red zone portion on Thursday of, some sort. I don't know how they run their practices, but I'm just thinking ultimately it's not a good sign if he's going to miss any sort of time throughout the week. So if in fact we get to Sunday night, you have to already decide whether or not you are playing someone like Chris Godwin, because it is the Sunday night game. And if he's a game time decision, those of us who believe that there may be a chance where Chris Godwin is going to be utilized at a lesser capacity, maybe he doesn't get the full range of snaps that he typically does, doesn't get as many targets, is going to kind of be slowly but surely brought up to full game speed, then Julio Jones is going to step up. If those are going to be the factors where Mike Evans on the other side of the field taking double coverage, maybe Julio Jones on the opposite side can find a lot of success. Again, last season, the Dallas Cowboys secondary, their primary 3 cornerbacks, they gave up a lot of yardage. Again, Diggs gave up over 1,000 receiving yards last season in coverage. That was number 1 amongst all cornerbacks, giving up the most yards. Brown, their other cornerback, gave up 821. That was the 4th most amongst all cornerbacks last season. And Lewis gave up 645, the 15th most. That trio gave up 14 touchdowns last season. There's a lot of potential for Tom Brady to tear apart this defense and get back to playing as well as he has in the last couple of years, especially with Julio Jones as an available option. I purely believe he could step into that Rob Gronkowski red zone role on top of being that Antonio Brown for this team. Someone that is going to stretch the field, who is going to see a boatload of targets. If we see Julio Jones get 8 targets out of the 45 passing attempts that Tom Brady has on Sunday night, are we going to be surprised? I'm not going to be. And that's why I'm thinking this could be an option that you could go with this week in a deeper league. All right, moving on to our final must-start player. This is another contingency player. If J.K. Dobbins gets to Sunday and he is not available to play against the New York Jets, I think Mike Davis could very easily fill in. Now, when I look at Mike Davis in comparison to Kenyon Drake hasn't been with the team for very long, and there is a chance that Mike Davis, considering he's more comfortable with the offense, is more of a reliable pass blocking threat on third downs in the backfield, could continue to get more and more looks. Currently only being started in 6% of leagues. Again, if in fact J.K. Dobbins becomes inactive, I expect that number to skyrocket. So if in fact he's available for you, maybe check that out, maybe pick him up. Now, last season he played with the Atlanta Falcons, and though he wasn't very successful, we have to remember he played behind an offensive line that wasn't very talented in an Atlanta Falcons scheme that had him as the secondary running back, but he still found success when given opportunity ultimately. Like when he played against the New York Jets in specific last season, that being relevant considering they play them this week, but when he took them on, he had 13 rushing attempts for the Atlanta Falcons for 53 rushing yards, a 4.1 yard per carry average, 1 rushing touchdown, 5 targets, 2 catches, 8 receiving yards, and 11.1 half PPR fantasy points. If you're able to put him behind a Ravens offensive line in this scheme, honestly, a lot of success is going to be found, because if Latavius Murray and Devontae Freeman could find success, anyone can. That's why I'm thinking that if J.K. Dobbins is an inactive force here, Mike Davis may be a potential play option for week 1. All right, now that we've covered all that, we can go ahead and move on and talk some pick'ems for week 1 of the 2022 season. All right, don't forget to travel to Underdog Fantasy today if you are looking to participate in their pick'ems game. Again, you're picking higher or lower on a player statistic. I'm going to be putting together some pick'em slips talking about some specific statistics and whether I'm picking higher or lower going into week 1. You could travel to the description of the video, click on the link, and use promo code Andrew today. When you do so and make a first-time deposit, promo code Andrew will get you a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about some of the pick'ems this week. Again, there are so many. I think there's over 100 total. The amount of pick'ems just in the case of Jameis Winston is crazy, but I'm going to be scrolling down this list at a pretty quick pace just to kind of give you an idea as to what we're talking about. But there's a couple players that I wanted to mention. First and foremost, obviously, you can make a pick'em slip for any player. You can make an argument higher or lower for any player. But for the first game of the weekend, I thought, okay, let's talk about Cordero Patterson. I personally have him relatively lower ranked in my running back rankings video earlier this week, and I'm beginning to lean towards potentially sitting him in this upcoming weekend's contest. And the primary reason behind that is because of the matchup. Again, you're playing against the New Orleans Saints. Last season, in the 2 games that he played against the Saints, he had 13 rushing attempts for 22 rushing yards total. Again, in one game, he had 9 rushing attempts, in the other 4 rushing attempts. The Atlanta Falcons are aware that they don't find much success against that New Orleans Saints run-stopping defense. And when you look at the potential of some of these overall, higher or lower pick'ems, 32.5 rushing yards, I'm thinking that that's a number that I'm relatively comfortable going lower with. Now, yes, can he get receiving work? Absolutely. Can he get himself those receiving yards? Absolutely. We saw him do that last year where he had over 100 receiving yards in a game against this team. But in the ability of getting over 10 rushing attempts, he didn't do that last year against this team. And in fact, in terms of the amount of rushing attempts he had all of last season, the amount of times he was able to go over 10 rushing attempts in a year was only 6 out of the potential 16 games he played in. And to maintain on the subject of his total rushing yards, he was only able to get more than 33 rushing yards in 8 of the 16 games last year. So again, more than not, we're seeing either a 50-50 split of where he's not getting the yardage, especially against this defense, and he's not getting many rushing attempts, especially against this defense. I think, for me personally, both, I can't pick both of them. You can pick one or the other for a singular player. Maybe you could do it for different slips, but in my opinion, personally, I don't think Cordero Patterson is going to be given, enough rushing attempts to service this many yards. I'm leaning lower on this. We'll go ahead and put together a slip later on, but we're going to continue to scroll down and talk about more of these players. Let's talk about Deebo Samuel. Now, Kyle Juszczyk has at this current moment in time 7 receiving yards. I guess that's a 50-50. He catches one pass. I think he can get himself over 8 receiving yards. But let's talk about Deebo Samuel. Let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk. 2 players that could have great value this week. We already talked about Brandon Aiyuk. We expect him to find success. I think higher here, I'm expecting him to play well. So those kind of numbers seem like they're pretty relatively fair. Now, in the case of Deebo Samuel, the fact that his number is at 55.5 is kind of surprising to me. That's relatively low. Again, we've talked about it earlier this week. Deebo Samuel has found a lot of success when he was the primary receiving threat of this offense. Last season, weeks 1 through 10, the guy was able to get himself over 58 receiving yards in 8 out of the 9 games and able to get himself 5 or more receptions in 8 out of those 9 games. So ultimately, a lot of success has been found. Even in the later half of the year, weeks 15 through 18, 4 out of those 4 weeks, he was able to get himself over 58 receiving yards. So the fact that the number is 55.5, that is also a number that I'm leaning towards going higher. I think both these guys are going to be able to find their success either way, continuing to move on. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about a Cincinnati Bengal. Let's talk about T. Higgins. Right now, his number is at 71.5 receiving yards. That is relatively high in comparison to what we just talked about with Deebo Samuel. We just talked about, with Brandon Aiyuk. Now, in this current circumstance, I'm leaning towards higher with this T. Higgins number. Again, in 7 of his last 10 games that he has played, including the NFL playoffs, he's been able to get over 90 receiving yards. If you take a wider spectrum looking at all of last season, in 13 of his total 17 games that he played, he was able to get over 78 receiving yards. I think this number is something that he's very eligible to accomplish. The last time he played against this team, was able to find a lot of success. Therefore, I'm leaning in the direction of going higher on this number. We have, the Philadelphia Eagles game. Okay, Miles Sanders currently in this position, 49.5 rushing yards. Listen, I think this is an over. I already mentioned it earlier in regards to what his potential is against the Detroit Lions defense. I'm leaning towards the higher on Miles Sanders. Let's continue to scroll down, see what else we can find here. Of course, we got DeAndre Swift with a bunch of numbers, Jamal Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Again, if in fact this offensive line has a couple pieces missing, I know Ragnow and Vaitai are kind of in that mix of potentially missing this week. Amon-Ra St. Brown, look at his numbers to potentially be a little bit higher and similar to what it was late last season because they're going to have to pass the ball even more. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about Mike Gesicki now for the Miami Dolphins. Another one of these players that I'm leaning towards the lower on in all capacities, and I'll tell you exactly why. In the last 3 years that he has taken on the New England Patriots, he has only had one game of over 5.85 fantasy points. And if you're able to get into a conversation where, okay, he has to go over 31 receiving yards and he has to go over 5.85 half PPR fantasy points. He was only able to do both those things once, and it was in a singular game back in 2019. In my opinion, I'm looking at Mike Gesicki and his struggles over the last 2 years, the fact that this offense is kind of leaning away from featuring him as a slot receiving option because, again, Mike McDaniel comes in with a run-first approach. This is not a run-blocking tight end in any capacity. He's more of a receiver than he is, a run-blocking threat. Therefore, they'd much rather have a Cedric Wilson or Chase Edmonds out in the slot. Of course, you still have Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. There are so many more threats on the field that they can use in his stead. And we already know how Bill Belichick functions. He always shuts down tight ends. Last season, they gave up the fewest points per week to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format. I think it's going to be much of the same this upcoming week. That's why we're leaning away and leaning towards the lower number in regards to Mike Gesicki this week. Now, let's go ahead and let's speed run a couple of these. Let's see. What do we have here that's exciting? Elijah Moore, over 50. I mean, again, I think this is another one of those numbers that if you can go ahead, take the higher here, maybe even on the receptions we go higher. I mean, to be honest, either one. I think Elijah Moore is going to be able to break those numbers. And a lot of people are sleeping on these fantasy prospects based on the matchups. Moving on, let's see here. What else do we have? Trevor Lawrence, his rushing stats, 16.5. If he can get 17 rushing yards, if I'm not mistaken, last season he was able to accomplish that 8 times. So it's kind of like in that 50-50 range. If you're able to kind of see the pass rush get after him, the offensive line falls apart. He has the ability to make some plays with his legs. I wouldn't be surprised if he was able to accomplish that number. Of course, we have, Travis Etienne receiving yards. That's going to be a little bit of a toss-up. We're just kind of have to wait and see what him and James Robinson look like as a duo out of this backfield. I'm just going to continue to scroll because, again, there's a lot of potential pick'ems here. This is one that I like. Again, we talked about Kareem Hunt earlier. I think he very easily get over 33 rushing yards. I mean, this is a really low number that, again, is kind of almost disrespectful, but hey, we're going to take advantage of it. But I like the idea of Nick Chubb with over 1 touchdown, whether it's rushing or receiving, it does not matter. In the last 2 years, Nick Chubb has scored 21 touchdowns in 25 healthy games. If we're going to be in a scenario where we're looking towards the odds of him scoring a touchdown against the Carolina Panthers, I'm thinking that's probably on the over. I think he could score easily a touchdown in this contest. Scrolling down because there's a lot to talk about. Whether it is Christian McCaffrey receiving yards, he could very easily accomplish that. Oh my goodness, there are so many. Naeem Hines receiving yards, I think that is easily accomplishable as well if that's more of a competitive matchup. Moving on, we have a lot more to talk about. Holy moly, I mean, I'm telling you guys, any player that you could possibly, Brevin Jordan, the tight end for the Houston Texans, even has a pick'em that if you're feeling higher or lower on, you could take advantage of. But let's get into this this Giants versus Tennessee game. I think I saw one earlier. Yeah, here we go. Derrick Henry. Will he get 24 or more rushing attempts? I mean, this is something that, again, when you look at his numbers last year and how much utilization he was getting prior to his injury, it was crazy. He had 6 of his 8 games with 28 or more rushing attempts. So if we're thinking 24, I mean, why not? Why wouldn't Derrick Henry be able to put up 24 rushing attempts? Maybe if we're in a conversation where they're blowing out the Giants and there's no competition and no need for him to run the ball in the fourth quarter, then by all means, at that point, we'd lean in the direction of going under. But as of right now, could be a competitive matchup. Could be one that Derrick Henry continues to get utilization from. Moving on, we have Aaron Jones. Okay, I like this one. Aaron Jones, over under a touchdown. We've mentioned it multiple times. He has scored 40 touchdowns in the last 45 games. Now, it's not a 1-for-1 rate there. There's some games in which he scored 4 touchdowns, some games he scored 3, and a lot of them in which he scored 0. But when we're talking about a running back and their exposure to opportunity to getting a lot of touchdowns, again, Aaron Jones is in a pretty safe spot at this position. Moving on, let's see here. We got Randall Cobb. That could be a very easy number that he could accomplish. 4 receptions for him and Sammy Watkins. I feel like they're going to have to be the case. With Allen Lazard probably missing this upcoming week, these are the 2 most veteran receiving options. They most likely are going to get a lot of opportunity in that regard. Dalvin Cook, his yardage counts, a lot of fantasy points could be had here. If you're expecting, Dalvin Cook to get over 16.5 half PPR fantasy points, which I'm expecting, could go higher on that number, could go lower if you're expecting less. A lot of numbers here. We talked about Patrick Mahomes the other day during our quarterback video. I mean, where does it end, actually? I'm actually curious. Okay, Josh Jacobs, we got some numbers there. Dude, there are so many numbers. Okay, either way, Gerald Everett, welcome. I believe Gerald Everett is very capable of getting over 31 receiving yards. Another one of these slips that you could end up putting together. Speaking of, let's go ahead. Let's put together some slips. Let's end today's video on a high note, putting them together and seeing how they perform this upcoming weekend. All right, so as you can see on screen, we have a singular pick'em slip here. We have Cordero Patterson under on his rushing yards, Mike Gesicki under on his receiving yards. We're going over on the Elijah Moore receptions. We're going over on the Kareem Hunt total rushing yards, and over on the Gerald Everett receiving yards. If, in fact, we were to go ahead and, for example, make a $10 bet here in this regard, we would 20 times our overall money. But if in fact you were not as confident that all 5 of them were going to be, for sure plays, and you were thinking, okay, if there was only a way for me to at least have a little bit of forgiveness, well, that's exactly why this insurance button here is in place. For those of you who are interested and you want to go ahead and kind of take an idea of, okay, I know that at least 4 of these 5 players are going to accomplish it, just don't know who. You can go ahead and click this button. You do get lower odds, but one of them can miss. And if they do, you're in a position to where you're still making some money. You can go ahead and check that out. As of this current moment in time, I'm willing to take this bet. I'm going to go ahead and submit that right now. I don't even need the insurance. We're going to confirm that. Now, when I scrolled down this list, I found even more, potential pick'ems that I liked on the under. Again, you guys know that I don't believe that Zeke is going to be able to get over 47 rushing yards against Tampa Bay. Very rarely can Zeke get that number, in general, based on his performances last year. But the fact that Tampa Bay's defense locked him down week 1 of last year, there have been a defense that has stopped just about anybody. Leads me to believe this is another one of those plays that you can go ahead and make, potentially make a $5 bet. I mean, again, you want to put the insurance, you can, but I'm feeling confident on this one. We'll go ahead and confirm that. Boom, that one's done as well. Again, if you want to go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy, you can go ahead and do so today and play with, these hundreds of different pick'ems right now. Make some bets. I mean, there's baseball. There's so many damn pick'ems out here. Look at this. What is this? Is this college football? I mean, dude, there are some things here that I'm like, holy moly, it doesn't stop. Literally, this list even goes to soccer. I'm sure there's golf somewhere here. Dude, it doesn't just end with football. So again, if you're trying to put together a couple pick'em slips for this weekend, there's also the Rivals contest where you can go ahead, click on this link, and they have head-to-head players. Marcus Mariota versus Jameis Winston, total yards. Who's going to have more? Marcus Mariota is given, 5.5 extra yards. So 6 extra yards in his direction. Which way are we going? Fewer interceptions. Who's going to throw less interceptions between the two? You can pick, add those to your pick'em slips, etc. A lot of fun to be had. Check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. When you sign up, make a first-time deposit. Using the code, you get a deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit 50, they'll match 50. I want to thank you guys for watching today's video. Tomorrow, again, we'll be live streaming 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel and 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on Sunday morning kickoff with Kirikoff with my updated rankings. Be sure to come check those out. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.